I'm going to try to explain school funding in Oregon in 8 minutes or less to get everybody on this call and who's going to listen to the recording kind of on the same page a little bit about how the basics of this funding system works before we then go into discussion and talk about all the nice little details that make it up. So without further ado, I'll go right into it. It should take about 8 minutes. And once, if questions pop in your mind, well, then just start putting them into the chat so we can get back to them. So, Oregon K-12 funding system overview. There are basically 3 main buckets of where funding for schools come from. It's federal, it's state, and it's local. And tonight, the federal funding, I want to mostly ignore because we're here to be focusing on what's happening in Oregon. But just for context, federal funding, that's mostly Title I, that's special ed, school lunches, and obviously in the last few years, it's been the COVID relief funding that's now drying up and not getting renewed, unfortunately. And I'm just going to leave federal funding at that. So let's talk about state and local funding and how they interact. So within state funding, there are 2 main buckets. One is the Student Success Act, which is the money from the corporate activity tax that was passed in 2019. And the other one is the State School Fund, SSF. And that's the infamous $10.2 billion commonly used in media and legislature to describe state funding. So, and I want to note that's $10.2 billion for 2 years because we're on biennial budgets, obviously. So where does that money come from and where does it go? The majority of it comes from the general fund, $8.8 billion. There's another about $740 million that comes actually from the Student Success Act, $600 million from lottery, $40 million from the Marijuana tax. But again, vast majority, general fund, $8.8 billion. So now you may be wondering, where does the general fund money come from? More than 80% of the general fund is personal income tax, taxes that you and I pay. About 10% is corporate income tax, so think Intel, Nike, and so forth. And then the remainder, which is about 6 to 7%, of various taxes and fees, estate taxes, interest earnings from the state, liquor tax, and so forth. So I just want to show real briefly how the general fund, lottery fund, has developed over time, has increased significantly in the last few years, and compare that with how the state school fund allocations has increased. I'll get to the Student Success Act at the end, so let's continue to focus on the SSF and how it interacts with local funding. Local funding, that's mostly property taxes. This biennium, the calculation shows about $5.1 billion in local taxes, 4.9 billion of which local property taxes. And those are the taxes that are affected by Measure 5 and Measure 50. General fund, lottery fund, Student Success Act, by the way, aren't affected by Measure 5 and 50. In local funding, there's some other smaller taxes that are mostly relevant for very specific regions, for example, the timber tax for those counties. So locally, then you also have the local option levies and the local school bonds at the bottom right there. We'll get back to them later, so I'll make them disappear again. The next step is really important and also a bit complicated, so I'll try to be extra precise. The state school fund, the SSF, and the local funding get hypothetically combined into one pot, which is called the formula funding. And that combined money is then distributed based on a certain formula to all the school districts in the state. And we'll get to the formula in a minute. It's a hypothetical pot because in reality, the local districts keep all their local funding in their own accounts, and the state simply uses the information of how much there is in each district to come up with the formula funding number. So there are $15.3 billion to distribute. 10.2 from the state school fund and 5.1 from local sources. Right on top, out of those 15.3, there are some carve-outs that the legislature made for specific educational purposes. And here's a list. I'll share the presentation afterward, so don't worry to try to decipher all of this. The carve-outs combined are about $230 million. And some of that actually does end up in school districts later. In addition, there are $350 million that go to education service districts, the ESDs, which use that funding to support students and districts in their region. For example, in Multnomah County, it's my understanding the Multnomah ESD pays for the school nurses that we have in our school. So next, let's get to the formula itself. The formula consists of a few grants that school districts receive. There's a small facilities grant and a high cost disability account. But the biggest two, and those are the ones on the slide, are the transportation grant, which covers between 70 to 90% of districts' transportation costs, school buses mostly. And then the biggest grant of them all is the general purpose grant, $14 billion roughly. That's the money that goes into our schools' district's general fund. So how do we decide how much each school district gets out of those $14 million? So that's the formula. And it's mostly based on the number of students that each district has, with some students carrying additional weights. So for example, students with IEPs count twice, English learners count 1.5, students in poverty or foster care count 1.25, and a few other adjustments. There's also an adjustment for teacher experience, but I don't want to get into that. So now going back to how the money is actually distributed. The way it works is that the state calculates how much funding a district should get according to the formula, checks how much local funding the district has from its sources, and then pays out the difference from the state school fund. In other words, local tax revenue always stays with each district. And that varies quite a lot between districts. A few districts are actually 100% locally funded. Those are districts that have a lot of local timber revenue, as far as I understand. And then there are those on the other end with a lot of red that really depend on state funding to supplement their their local sources. And as you can see on top of the graphic, that is, districts do get roughly the same amount for each weighted student. And that's the point of the formula. So two more things we need to talk about before I turn it over to Jackie and Morgan. One, coming back to the local option levies and bonds. Both are local property taxes, and levies typically pay for operational costs, mostly teachers, while bonds are for facilities, for buildings, capital improvements. They're both local property taxes, as I said, and because they're property taxes, impacted by Measure 5 and 50. And slightly different for each of them, and I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole right now. What is important to know, though, is that only a small number of school districts have them. Here's a list of the school districts that have local option levies. So about 15, 17, I think. But it does include some of the biggest districts by student population. So finally, I want to come back, round it up to the SSA, the Student Success Act. And I'll only do that briefly because there's a lot within the Student Success Act that we could fill a whole evening with, and maybe we'll do that at one point. So just real briefly, it's again the corporate activity tax that goes in there, and all of that money has to go to education by law. And there's a major difference from the general purpose grant from the SSF. It can only be used for a number of distinct purposes and does not go into the general fund and the districts. So $2.9 billion is expected for this biennium. Some of that goes to the SSF, and the remainder of it, some goes to school district for those purposes, some goes to ODE for statewide initiatives, some goes to early learning, which obviously is education as well. So, and that's school funding in Oregon in 10 minutes. And if you're interested, we have a more comprehensive version of this graph, which goes into a little bit more details on our website. But I want to make sure that we'll cover the basics first, the big picture before we go into details. So